So, Kello.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the nice introduction. And in particular, thanks for inviting me. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person for what seems to be a very exciting workshop. So anyway, as you said, I'll be talking about language and vision. And in particular, I'll be talking about how the two modalities are integrated in human cognition. And this is joint work with Moreno Coco, Eunice Fernandes, and Manabu Arai. Here's a quick overview about what I'm going to talk about. So I will first argue that human cognition is an integrated system, and the processes and representations that system avails itself of have to be multimodal. They have to integrate multiple modalities, and we'll see a few examples in a moment. Then I'll sort of zoom in on one particular case, which is the interaction of vision and language, and in particular in tasks like language production. And I will argue that grounding of the objects that we attend when we produce language is really important and drives this process. And in particular, I will show how this correlation between the two modalities can be measured. And this actually goes back to some old work by Moreno and myself. So I'll quickly introduce that, and then I will open. I will raise some research questions based on that work, and these questions deal with, first of all, how general this effect is, this correlation between attention and production, and in particular whether it generalizes across other languages. Languages differ quite a lot in structure, syntactic structure, maybe in semantics as well, lexical structure, and so on. So how general is that effect? And in particular, does it also generalize across languages? And we'll see what that means in a moment. And the second question I'm asking is whether this question is driven by syntactic or semantic similarity or dissimilarity across languages. And so I will investigate that in the second part of this talk. And then finally, I'll draw some conclusions about visual grounding more generally based on the answers we come up with to the first two questions. Okay, but let's start at why things are multimodal, why this is worth looking at. So a lot of cognitive processes in everyday life are multimodal. So here, this example is supposed to illustrate driving. We have a driver who, of course, uses their visual system to look at the road, to look at the mirror, maybe to look at the hands. They are at the same time exercising motor control and getting haptic feedback. For example, the hands are on the steering wheel, they're turning the steering wheel and so on. So these two modalities of motorics and vision need to be integrated for driving, and maybe other ones as well. There's auditory cues, there's maybe someone talking to the driver at the same time. So it's highly multimodal. And this is just a very everyday process that most of us carry out every day. Here's another example. We have a woman here describing or explaining something in a painting. And of course, she's looking at the painting, picking out certain objects, and then she's uttering sentences like the man is sitting there with a, I don't know, violin or whatever it is. And again, this is a multimodal process. The speaker is looking at the painting, but she might also be looking at the audience. Obviously, she needs to take in the visual information, but she's also uttering sentences, maybe listening to what the audience is saying if they're asking questions and so on. And again, it's a highly multimodal process, a bit like this talk actually, right? Where you have a slide with text, images, but you're also listening to me talking at the same time. So this is really, really very common. And obviously, this hasn't escaped the attention of cognitive scientists. So there's quite a lot of studies already. And here I've just picked out three examples that are pretty well known. So Michael Land in the 90s already eye-tracked himself making tea. And this is a fairly famous study where you can follow the attention pattern in an everyday action like tea making. Driving has been studied as well. there's a fairly large literature on studying dialogue in a multimodal way and collaborative problem solving. And this is just an example of a study that Moreno and I have done. And of course, in language comprehension and language production, in particular, the work by Griffin and Bock, going back to the early 2000s, who looked at language production in a visual context. Here, we will focus on those two modalities, the visual and the linguistic modality, and we'll also look at language production. Paradigm is a bit different from the one by Griffin and Bock, but it's the same overall motivation. Okay, so we need to introduce another concept before we can get started here. So as I said, the idea is to study language production in a multimodal context. So by multimodal, we just mean a visual scene, an image like this here. So there's a man at a counter, maybe in a hotel, and someone else is signing a sheet of paper. There's some plants, a lot of suitcases, and so on. So it's a fairly busy scene, and then we ask participants to describe the scene. We give them a cue. So in this case, it would be either suitcase or man as the cue. And then they might say something like, the suitcase is on the counter next to the man. And we're eye tracking them while they're uttering this sentence. So we know which parts of the image they're fixating when in the course of producing that sentence. And this sequence of fixations is called a scan pattern. And we conceptualize the scan pattern as a sequence of objects. So participants view a scene, they generate a scan pattern, and this can be seen as a sequence of objects. So for example, they fixate the man first, the man with the white shirt, then the man in the suit, then the suitcase, then the plant, then they go back to the man in the suit, and so on. Okay, so we can basically cut out the objects from the scene and then order these objects in the order in which they're fixated. So, and we'll call this a scan pattern. Of course, words are similar in some sense and maybe slightly more straightforward. Of course, a sentence is also a set of words. So in this case, it's the suitcase is on the counter and so on. Okay, so we basically have two sequences. And the rest of this talk will all be about comparing those two sequences. That's really what we're interested in. Okay, so we motivated this whole work by saying, well, there's those two modalities. In general, there's more, but here we'll focus on language and vision. And somehow these modalities need to be integrated or coordinated for cognition to happen. For example, for sentence, for image description to happen. And how is it possible to make this happen? So we will assume the following hypothesis, that what is important about multimodal cognition is the reference, the things that we're talking about or that we're looking at if it's a visual modality. And so speakers use these references to coordinate across modalities. So for example, a noun phrase will be grounded into objects. So this link between the two modalities, we call it grounding. And noun phrases and objects are sort of the obvious case, but verbs will be grounded into actions, adjectives will be grounded into attributes, and so on. So this is not confined to a single part of speech. Okay, so this is just an assumption, just a hypothesis at this point, but it does make some prediction, and we'll look at those predictions now. So in particular, we would expect that if two participants follow a similar scan pattern, remember scan pattern was this, a sequence of fixated objects, then they would also produce a similar sentence, a similar sequence of words when they're describing the image. And so ultimately, a scan pattern allows us to predict the sentence or the other way around. The sentence allows us to predict the scan pattern because we are assuming that these objects here are grounded into words and the other way around. So this is a correlational claim, right? So we don't say the scan pattern is causing the sentence or the other way around. We're just saying the two are correlated. And to test this, we need similarity measures for both the scan pattern and the sentence. And I won't say a lot about the similarity measures now. This will come later in the talk, but just to make this general idea plausible, here's another diagram. Okay, so we have our first subject here, and they are uttering a sentence. The suitcase is on the counter next to the man, and they're following a scan pattern here. So the sequence of objects is a scan pattern. So this is subject one. Then we have another subject who might say the suitcase is on the counter, and they follow this scan pattern here. And what we can see here is that the sentences are similar and the scan patterns are similar. That's essentially the claim, right? If one is similar, then the other one is also similar. Subject three, on the other hand, say the man is signing in, and they follow this scan pattern here. Man in the white shirt, statue, man in the suit. So quite different from the scan pattern here. So this is, again, because the sentence is similar, we would expect the scan pattern to also be similar, dissimilar, sorry. Okay, so the correlational claim is about if the sentence is similar, then the scan pattern is similar. If the sentence is different, then the scan pattern is also different. So we can test this by simply computing the similarity between sentences and scan patterns. So this was our hypothesis, just to remind you. Speakers use reference to coordinate across modalities, for example, noun phrases and objects. And if we now give participants a sentence description task, then we can measure the similarity of the scan patterns they produce and the similarity of the sentences they generate. And the prediction is that these two should correlate if our grounding hypothesis is correct. Okay, and I wouldn't be here if this wasn't, oh yeah, the similarity measures I'll come back to. And I wouldn't be here if this wasn't the case. So this is I don't want to say classic study, but old study that we did more than 10 years ago. And what we can see here is the sentence similarity on the x-axis. So here we have two sentences and we compare how similar they are. And I'll explain in a moment how, but let's assume we have a similarity measure over sentences. And then here on the y-axis, we have a similarity measure across scan patterns. And what we see is that the two correlate. Right, it's not perfectly linear, but there's a clear correlation, and this actually holds across various phases of the production process. So there's a preparation phase, then there's the actual production phase, there's a planning phase, and so on. So in that work, we divided up the scan pattern into these phases, which will not be relevant to today's talk, but it's just something to bear in mind that this is actually general across different phases. And here we have a baseline where we just scramble the scan pattern and the image, and the effect goes away. This is just a sanity check that this isn't an artifact about eye tracking in general or sentence production in general. It's really particular to the right scan pattern being paired with the right sentence. Okay, so this is an existing result, existing evidence for this grounding hypothesis. Just to sum it up quickly, so we have argued that human cognition is an integrated system. Processes and representations are both multimodal. And in particular, there's this effect of grounding. So if we describe a visual scene, then the objects that we attend are grounded, the words that we utter are grounded in the objects we attend. And evidence for this is this correlation that we've just seen here on the previous slide. Visual attention in terms of scan pattern and language production in terms of sentences correlate across those two modalities. Okay, and now for the rest of the talk, we're going to ask how general is this effect? Is this just something that happens for this particular experiment, for this particular language? Particularly, we'll ask, does this effect generalize across different languages? Languages, you know, for example, Japanese has a different word order, is verb final, is quite different from English in that respect. Does the effect still hold? And next we will ask, is this effect actually driven by semantics or syntax? Right, so here I have not told you how I measure sentence similarity. This could be syntactic similarity or semantic similarity, and which one is driving the effect. So that's the second question we'll ask. And then we'll, this will be more speculative. We'll ask, what does this tell us about visual grounding more generally? Okay, so let's just conceptualize this in a bit more detail. So the idea is to test generality of the grounding effect that we've seen for English. So to remind you, this was participant one. They are uttering a sentence and following a scan pattern. Participant two were similar scan pattern, therefore similar sentence. And participant three was different sentence, different scan pattern. And this was for the same scene. So all these three participants saw the same scene. Does it actually hold if the scene is different? Oh, something happened to the animation here. Okay, if the scene is different. So for example, here, this is another scene, which you could describe in a similar way, because there's also people, there's a counter, there's suitcases and so on. It's a hotel setting, so it's not completely different, but it's of course visually, it's clearly distinct. So do we get similar scan pattern? Do people use similar sentences if they employ similar scan patterns, even though the scene is different? That is our first question. And the second question is what happens in other languages. In particular, we're going to look at Portuguese and Japanese. So Portuguese is relatively similar to English, has the same word order, for example, SVO, whereas Japanese has a different word order, is verb final. There's lots of other differences from English in those two languages. And now the question is, does our effect of the correlation between scan pattern similarity and sentence similarity, does that effect actually generalize to those languages? So we collected some data. We had a total of 74 participants. 24 were English speakers, 28 were Portuguese speakers, and 20 Japanese speakers. We asked them to describe 24 scenes, the same scenes in all three languages. And they were first prompted by an ambiguous cue word. So in this example here, this would have been suitcase or man. As you can see, the pictures have been photoshopped so that there's two suitcases and two men. So that creates an ambiguity. This is because we also wanted to study ambiguity, but this is a separate question and a separate paper that I'm not going to talk about here. I'm only going to talk about the correlation between scan patterns and sentences. Okay, so participants were eye-tracked while they produced those sentences. Then poor graduate students had to actually transcribe the speech, and all the studies were done on the transcribed speech, on the written version, right? We didn't look at actual audio files or anything like that for the purposes of the study. Okay, so in total we get around 1,700 sentences paired with scan patterns by these generated by these 74 participants. Obviously, we also had to segment the images into regions. So here you can see the regions for the example picture that I've used, because the scan patterns are coded in terms of these regions here: paper, plant pot, torso, leg, head, and so on. So these, and then if the fixation was within the region, then that's the region that we used for the scan pattern. Some interesting observations. So sentence complexity can differ quite a lot. In particular, we saw that in Portuguese, people produced longer sentences. It's not quite clear how and why, but that's the case. Scan pattern length also differed. So we have a preparation phase where people just view the image and they don't say anything yet. And that ranged between 800 milliseconds and 10 seconds. And then we have a production phase that ranged between 2 seconds and 18 seconds. What I'll show now is for the production phase, but as I've said previously, it holds for other phases for the preparation phase, for example, as well. Okay, so now finally, let me tell you about similarity. So first, let's look at scan pattern similarity, and there we use a measure called longest common subsequence. And I'll explain this briefly. So we have two scan patterns. This is the first one here, has a length of 5. 5 objects were fixated. So it's man, plant, statue, man, man in the white shirt, and so on. And then we have a second scan pattern here, which is shorter. Length is 4. And now what this algorithm does, it figures out all the common subsequences. So for example, man, suitcase man, 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 statue man, man, statue man would be a subsequence for that occurs in both. Shorter subsequences like man, statue, or statue man also occur, and then we don't count single object overlap. But we come up with all the common subsequences here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 common subsequences. We pick the longest one, which is this one here, man, statue man. Count the length is 3. And then we take the length here and normalize it by the average length of the two subsequences. So this is just a geometric mean of the length of subsequence 1 and scan pattern 1 and scan pattern 2. So if the two scan patterns were identical, then this would give us 1. If they had no common subsequences, this would be 0. In this case, we have 3 as the length of the longest common subsequence. So this gives us a similarity of 0.67. Okay, so this is fairly straightforward and can be used basically to compute the similarity of any two sequences of distinct objects. Okay, and so we're using this to compare scan patterns. What about sentences? So sentences we compare using semantic embeddings. So we use an embedding measure derived from the universal sentence encoder, which is slightly dated now, but it's one of the many ways to compute sentence embeddings. So this is just a network trained on a large cross-lingual corpus, and it gives us embeddings in the familiar way. So we can use things like cosine or dot product. Here, these are just an example using word embeddings, where child, infant, and girl are close together, boy is further away, man and grandfather are up here. So similar words are similar in embedding space, and what USC gives us is an embedding space for sentences in the same way. So this way we can compare sentences. But what about different languages? Sorry. Here, this is an example for comparing sentences. So something like, I like my phone, the phone is not good, the cell phone is great. These sentences are similar, or these sentences down here, how old are you, what is your age, are similar. Whereas sentences like, will it snow tomorrow, or how old are you, are not very similar. So you have low similarity scores for sentences that basically don't have anything to do with each other. So we can compare sentences. What about different languages? Well, use is a multilingual model. So it projects sentences across different languages into the same embedding space. So that means we can use to compute similarity across sentences. So we can compute the similarity of a Portuguese sentence and a Japanese sentence, for example. And that's what we will use to compare sentence similarity. And we will use the dot product as our similarity measure to measure the distance between embeddings. So that is measuring semantic similarity, right? We're hoping that word embeddings or sentence embeddings in this case measure something about the semantics of the sentence. But what about syntax? So for syntax, we actually do something quite similar to what we do for scan patterns. So here, this is another example, 2 Japanese sentences here, and the scan patterns in yellow and red by 2 participants. The keyword here would be man. And these are the two sentences that the participants uttered: two men working in the office, or two men are in the office. So they're quite similar. And to measure the syntactic similarity, we just turn them into sequences of parts of speech. We use Spacey. Spacey again is multilingual, can be applied to Japanese, Portuguese, English, other languages, of course, and uses the same part of speech tags for these languages. So we can compare the part of speech sequences for two participants in the same language, in this case, noun, noun, at position, and this is just noun, at position, noun, noun, and so on. How do we compare the similarity? Well, we can also use longest common subsequence, right? So this obviously works for any type of label. So it doesn't have to be objects. It can also be part of speech tags. So we are computing the longest common subsequence. And so we get three similarity measures. So for this trial, for example, the longest common subsequence on the scan patterns is 057. The semantic similarity using use vectors and the dot product is 089. You can see these sentences are really very similar semantically. And in terms of part of speech, again, we use the longest common subsequence, and here's the similarity is 0.71. Okay, so what we now correlate is these three similarity measures, both within languages and across languages, and both within scenes and across scenes. Okay, here's a slightly more elaborate example. So this is again a heat map of the similarity of different sentences. So for example, the man is working in the office, the man is in the office, high similarity 0.9, whereas something like the man is standing in the office unpacking a box while his colleague is, and so on, lower similarity compared to man is in the office. And that's similar to what we've done before, but what's new is that we can do this across different languages, right? So here on the x-axis, we have the Portuguese sentences. On the y-axis, we have the English sentences. And here, for example, similarity is high between those two sentences because this is a made-up example. These are just translations of each other. And so the use predicts a higher similarity, where sentences that are quite different, for example, here and here, get a low similarity. Okay, and now does this actually work? So this is our first case where we take scan pattern similarity here on the y-axis and sentence similarity on the x-axis, and we compare this within languages. So the first box is for English. In blue, if it's the same scene. In red, if it's two different scenes. As we can see, we can get a correlation between scan pattern and sentence similarity, both within scene and between scenes. Here, between scenes is lower and maybe a bit less nicely correlated because there's this bend here. But this is just a replication of the result for English, right? This is the old result for English, which we just replicate here. Then this is now new. This is for Portuguese. We get the same nice correlation between scenes within scenes, and for Japanese as well. So this doesn't seem to depend on the language. At least for these three languages, the effect seems to hold within the same language. And now the interesting question is, does this hold between languages as well? So what we do there is we take the same scene or a different scene, and we measure the similarity between the scan pattern in language 1 and language 2, and then the similarity between sentence for that scene in language 1 and language 2. And this is now for English and Portuguese, English and Japanese, and Portuguese and Japanese. And as we can see, it's maybe not perfect, but at least if it's the same scene, we clearly get the correlation. Quite similar to the correlation within languages. We now get a correlation between languages. If we do this for different scenes, the pattern still seems to hold. Maybe somewhat weaker, but it still holds. So we can conclude that semantically similar sentences are associated with similar scan patterns, both within the same language, but also across different languages. Okay, and now, of course, the interesting question is what happens if we do this with the syntactic similarity? So here on the y-axis, we still have scan pattern similarity as before, but on the x-axis, we now have syntactic similarity. So previous result was this was semantic similarity, right, with the use embeddings and the dot product. And here now we have the longest common subsequence, but for part of speech sequences. And what we can see if it's the same scene, so this is the blue curve here, it still sort of works, though something weird seems to happen in Japanese, maybe because it's verb final. So people, you know, obviously the verb position might influence how people, what kind of scan patterns they produce. So that might explain this dip here, but in any case, for Portuguese, it seems to be quite similar, and for English as well. But for Japanese, it doesn't work as well. And in particular, if it's between scenes, so these are the red curves, it works a lot worse. And then let's look between languages as well. And again, if we squint, we can still see an effect for the same scene, maybe less convincing than the semantic effect. But between different scenes, the effect really goes away. Okay, so to summarize this, we saw that syntactically similar scenes don't seem to be associated with similar scan patterns within languages or between languages. Right, the effect is much reduced or even absent, for example, for Japanese. Okay, quick sanity check. Just to check again that this isn't an artifact of our methodology, of the way we collected scan pattern, the way we annotated in images, or using the LCS measure or something like that. So we just shuffled the scan pattern in the sentences. So in all these results, the scan pattern and the sentence came from the same scene. Shuffling means that we're now pairing scan patterns and sentences from different scenes. And this is what's going on here. The effect completely goes away. Right, so this is the effect from the previous slide where the scan pattern is associated with the sentence from the same scene. And this is if we shuffle scan patterns and sentences. Okay, this is a sanity check. And then, of course, you will ask, well, but this is actually a statistically significant effect. And I will not bore you with all the details here, but yes, we have run our mixed effect models both for semantic similarity here in the first box or syntactic similarity in the second box, and for the shuffled. So if we shuffle, then the effect completely goes away. So it's all the different factors are highly significant for scan patterns associated with sentences, but if they're shuffled, then there's only the intercept left, so the effect goes away. All right, so that's all we have time for. Quickly to summarize what we've seen. So I have argued that semantically similar sentences are associated with similar scan patterns. We have seen that this relationship holds across languages and across scenes. So within languages, it doesn't seem to depend on the language. So even for languages that are different from English, like Japanese, it seems to hold. And it even holds across two different pairs of two different languages and also across different scenes. Syntactically, the picture is different. The effect was weak or absent, and the syntactic similarity of sentences doesn't seem to be very predictive of scan pattern similarity, again, across and within languages and scenes. I would like to suggest that this shows that visual grounding is mostly driven by semantics. It doesn't seem to be affected very much by the syntax of the individual languages. And I would also like to caution that this was only a single task. This was only a sentence description. And we yet have to show that this is actually an effect that holds across different tasks. Okay, thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Frank. So now we are turning to Q&A session. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand. online, offline. Yeah, Jishin.
Thank you so much for the very interesting talk. So I'm Jixin Li from City University of Hong Kong.
Hello.
So I just wondering, so if the finding is just semantics is important for associated with scan patterns, but then does that mean that semantics care about like the orders? So because we know that you can use passive voice or active voice, but the meaning of the sentence is the same, right? It doesn't. So why does it correlate with like the sequential orders where you look at the objects?
So the semantic measure that we've used is order independent. So that's probably what you're referring to. So use embeddings, they don't care about the order of the words in the sentence. We could, of course, use a semantically a measure that is order dependent, right? There's those as well. You could use position embeddings and so on. And in order to test the question whether the semantics is important, we would have to redo the study with a measure of semantic similarity that takes order into account.
Thank you.
Does it answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, because your argument is semantically similar sentences, right? So I'm
Yeah, and I think what you're thinking of is grounding in the sense of alignment, right? So what we're testing at the moment is only grounding in that the same objects are mentioned. But there's also grounding in the sense of alignment that the same objects are mentioned in the same order. But that's not something we can test, right? Because we're not dealing with alignments, right? We could compute an alignment between the words and the sentences and then measure the similarity of the alignment across languages. That would be a way of testing the relevance of order.
I think the East, who is online, is raising a hand, right?
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
Hello.
yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I wanted to ask about if you noticed any typical images that lead to more variation in what is being looked at and what is being said across languages. So maybe one image gives you higher correlation scores, but another image somehow kind of elicits more variation. And then would that affect the correlation between scan path and the sentences, but also across languages?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very interesting question. We have not looked at at images individually. What does make a big difference, though, is the exact formulation of the task. So this is not free production in the sense that we tell participants, just tell us what you see, but we give them a cue, right? So they get an object name, and they're told that their description they need to talk about this object. Their sentence need to contain that object, right? So that obviously guides production and probably enhances the similarity effect. And in particular, if the scene is very, very cluttered and there isn't any sort of clear foreground or background, and then if you do free production, I would expect there to be huge variation between what people say. But we are controlling the production process to some extent by queuing the participants.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask another one if there's no?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So I was wondering if there is a relation between, because I think at some point you mentioned speech onset times, like 800 milliseconds. So I was wondering if that would have an effect on the language that was generated. So if someone started really early versus someone who started 1-2 seconds later, would they have planned more, hence have a different syntactic kind of linear order, or is it just maybe independent of that?
That's a very interesting effect, and we haven't looked at that but you could, for example, bin the data into speakers who've taken a lot of time to plan and speakers who've spoken almost immediately. And you would maybe see different effects. It could also be that across languages, some languages maybe require more planning. And so the speech onset time is longer. What we have done, and this is quite interesting, is that this correlation that we saw holds also for the planning phase, right? So when people are not speaking yet, but if we take the sentence that they will speak and we align it with the scan pattern during planning, then that's similar. So people basically, they make the same scan pattern twice, once during planning and once during speaking.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, over there.
Hi, thanks for the nice talk. It's Frida Shi from the University of Waterloo here. So I was wondering if the visual saliency of the objects affect the visual grounding process. Have you found any related evidence of this?
We have not looked at this specifically, but my bet would be it does, just because there's a huge literature, of course, on visual saliency and how it affects scan patterns and scene viewing and so on. Here because the objects were queued, probably the effect of saliency as such is diminished because people already, they know they need to look for the suitcase or whatever the queue object is. But in general, I would expect salient objects to be mentioned first, for example, based on the previous literature. But yeah, that's something we would need to look at.